everybody. So we are about to have a very frank and practical conversation. So I hope you're all ready for it. And Katica will be around if anybody wants to ask her some questions afterwards. So just begin by telling us what you do and what your company does, especially using AI.
Yep. So I am a gender economist, which means that I look at the economy through the lens of gender. Tomorrow is Jobs Day, for instance, so I'll be providing commentary on what that looks like through an intersectional gender equity lens. I'm also the CEO and founder of Pipeline, and Pipeline is a software platform that increases the financial performance of companies through closing the intersectional gender equity gap, so gender plus race and ethnicity and age. We actually started with research, and we did research across 4,000 companies in 29 countries. And what we found was that for every 10% increase in intersectional gender equity, there's a 1 to 2% increase in revenue.
That is good stuff, but unfortunately it doesn't look like, well, I don't know. Do we have any business owners here in the audience? Good, fantastic. Oh, a couple. Good. So that's going to be interesting. You're going to need to pay attention a bit later. So this week we marked 100 days since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. And I think most women in America were absolutely horrified for the simple fact that whether or not you agree with abortion, it was the first time a right has been taken away from us. Yeah. I want to start by asking, what did that feel like for you as a woman personally? How did you feel when that ruling came in?
So there are really three foundational rights, which is the right to vote, the right to own property, and the right to choose. And so in the overturning of Roe v. Wade, we basically took that right away from 51% of our population. I was not surprised. I could see this coming. This was, from and I know we'll talk about it, but everything from inequity in the corporate world to what has been happening and how that actually connects to elected office. I think for me, what happened when I got the news that it was overturned, I was actually with my daughter in a plane. And what I thought, and she's 11, and what I thought about was how different it would be for her than it was for me.
Right, and again, the first time that she will have less rights than you did. So that was a personal. So you said you weren't surprised. So as a CEO, you must have been planning for this ruling to come in place. So I'm interested what, your opinion is as a CEO, as a business owner, how did that ruling and how does that ruling change things in the workplace?
Well, it's connected to it. It never really could have happened if we didn't have inequity in the workplace. And what I mean by that is that in the United States, women are 58% of college graduates. They're 47% of the labor base, and yet they're only 8% of Fortune 500 CEOs. We often talk about the gender pay gap. That is really table stakes. I'm talking about equity of opportunity, right? Mm-hmm. I have an MBA. I didn't get the women's MBA. I got an MBA, right? I should have the same opportunity as anyone else. And so what I thought about was, one, how to take care of our employees, and then second, the fact that it's not really enough to just enhance your healthcare coverage or to pay for abortion-related travel. There is so much more that needs to be done to actually ensure equity.
So you talked about specific things at work. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But, even before this ruling, even with the right to an abortion in every state, women were still scared to tell their boss that they were pregnant. They were still scared to ask for maternity leave because they thought they would be penalized. Yeah. Now, in over a dozen states, abortion is illegal. And that's roughly 30 million people in those states of, reproductive age. Now they're going to have to potentially ask for time off for an abortion. They're going to have to choose their workplace depending on whether that company would pay for them if they ever got pregnant. Because Nobody wakes up thinking, oh, I want to get pregnant today so I can get an abortion. It's just, that's just a fact. That does not happen. So do you think, as a woman, as a CEO, with all of the business acumen, your MBA, everything, all the circles that you work in, do you actually think it's physical that a woman can now go to a workplace and not feel like they're going to be penalized if they have to ask for one?
Well, I think if we look, so there's two things. One is that we know that moms actually experience inequity in the workplace. So this is connected to, if you look at what currently happens, projecting what could potentially happen for women who are asking for time off to have an abortion, or to travel, or to just have it in general. So one is that we know, for instance, that moms are, there is an undervaluing of moms in the labor force. It's called mommy tracking. So for each additional child that you have, you actually experience a wage decrease. We actually did a pipeline research for breadwinner moms. So moms that have, who are either the sole or primary breadwinner for their families. There's 16 million breadwinner moms in the United States. They support 28 million children. They have the largest gender pay gap of any women in the workforce. It's 66 cents on the dollar. And through an intersectional gender equity lens, so gender plus race and ethnicity, specifically for Black breadwinner moms, they actually have the largest gender pay gap of any women in the labor force. It's 44 cents on the dollar. And they support the majority of Black children and have for the last 30 years. So if you layer on what is already happening in the workforce right now, it is projected that that will absolutely happen.
So you basically spelled out there what to me sounds like workplaces penalizing mothers for having more than one child, because essentially
a child, you get penalized. You can get penalized for even being a woman of childbearing age, because there is a perception that you are less committed to your work because you're a mother. And yet what the research shows is that working moms are the most committed employees over the course of their career. So if there's any cohort of employees that you want to invest in, it's working moms. And that's not only an investment in today's labor force, it's actually an investment in the future, in 40% of our future labor force.
And I do want to point out that we're not talking about every single company, because there are some companies
for sure
that do very well, and there are some companies that treat mothers very well, but not enough is the point. But you brought up a very good point there, talking about women of color. So, this ruling, before the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, women of color were already disproportionately paid and penalized for things that happened in the workplace. And essentially this ruling is just widening that gap, not even building bridges. So how can we begin to bridge that divide?
Well, the other thing that you mentioned, I will answer your question, but the other thing that... The other thing that you mentioned, which I talked a little bit about, is the 3 foundational rights, right? The right to vote, the right to own property, and the right to choose. So all women in the United States did not have the right to vote until 1965, until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was actually clawed back in 2013 by a Supreme Court case. So if you are a woman of color in particular, you have had your rights impacted, those 3 foundational rights, for almost the last 10 years.
So
and then I will answer your question about the post-Roe work. But I think it's we are. This is not meant to be. We are in an election year. Your voice matters. I'm the daughter of an immigrant and a refugee. My father came here so that we would all have a voice, which he didn't have, and they didn't have, and that matters, right? It matters in terms of being able to be equal, right? Not relative equality, but actual equality. In the workplace, I talked a little bit about this. What we don't often do is, and what Pipeline does do through our software, is actually ensure not only equity of pay, but equity of opportunity. For instance, in performance reviews, we found that a third of all performance reviews contain bias. And 4% of the time, that leads to women receiving lower performance ratings. And while that might not sound like a lot, it actually takes women about, on average, twice as long to be promoted into the same role because of bias. So if you're looking at your talent pool, and currently, we'll see what the jobs report says tomorrow, but as of the last jobs report, we have 2 jobs open for every 1 person looking for a job. It makes sense for you to invest in your existing labor force, and not only in the jobs that they're in today, but actually ensure equity of opportunity.
So tell me more about what your company is doing specifically to kind of enhance things after the Supreme Court ruling and ensure, you just mentioned one, but tell me about some concrete things that your company's doing and that other companies can do.
Yeah, so, I mean, in addition to obviously supporting the right to choose, and in Colorado, where we are, that we have employees all over the country, the right to choose is legal in Colorado, but obviously we cover and support travel. But in addition to that, we were one of the early companies that also gives everybody the day off. An election day for us is a holiday. You absolutely have as much time as you need to go and vote, and that's not just the general election, but that's also primaries. That's also off years, etc. We give people 5 days to actually paid volunteer days to volunteer on causes that they care about. That matters in terms of civic responsibility and civic involvement. And then the last piece is that we are a supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment. I mean, the United States is one of very, very few countries that actually doesn't codify gender equity in the Constitution.
So, that's fantastic. But for a lot of women who now have to choose their workplace in states where they have to think, if something happened to me, would this company help me, pay for my travel? That's one thing, but that's just a physical. I mean, mental health is a big part of this. There is fear about even asking for time off if you're going to have a baby. There's fear, and obviously lots more issues that come up when you actually do have an abortion. How much weight do you think companies need to give to mental health and mental health practices in the workplace?
It's interesting that you talk about mental health, because from a gender equity perspective, mental health impacts everyone. But when we talk about gender equity, we're not just talking about women. Women are half the conversation and men are the other half of the conversation, and not just because they hold the majority of all leadership roles in companies, but also because mental health is actually largely a men's issue. And that doesn't mean it doesn't impact women. But if you look at the statistics, men they account for 79% of all suicides in the United States. Men and boys are 4 times more likely to die from suicide than women. Like, these are issues that we should be looking at through a gender equity perspective. We're not just about equity for women, we're about equity for everyone. Because gender inequity impacts men too.
So we're talking about the Roe v. Wade ruling, we're talking about gender equity in the workplace, but we've just come out of COVID, Well, the debate is on whether pandemic is still going on or whether we're out of it. But I think I have a quote here. So, the United Nations, less than a month after the World Health Organization declared the coronavirus outbreak a pandemic, they said that across every sphere, from health to the economy, security to social protection, the impact of COVID-19 is exacerbated for women and girls simply by virtue of their sex. So women were, unfairly impacted by coronavirus. There was already the gender pay gap. Now, there's the Roe v. Wade being overturned. And then on top of that, you've got inflation. If we have to think about all of these things, and companies need to think about all of these issues, but ultimately they also need to think about their bottom line, how can they responsibly work taking into account all of these issues?
So one of the ways to improve your bottom line is to improve your top line revenue. And we know from research, Pipeline's research, as well as collecting over 1 billion data points, that increasing equity in your company, intersectional gender equity, ties to your top line. So that's the first piece of that. Before the pandemic, all these things existed, sort of right underneath the surface, and then they came up through the pandemic, right? So, for instance, now there's talk about 2023, a recession in 2023. There was a, pretty dismal report this morning. Well, here's the fact that women have not yet recovered from the economic fallout from COVID-19. We actually have 1 million women missing from the labor force since the beginning of the pandemic. That's one piece. We did research and found that the inflation rate for goods and services that are marketed toward women is twice that of what it is targeted toward men, for goods and services targeted toward men. As the Fed actually increases rates, that negatively impacts women because being a woman is a credit risk. We pay higher rates for things like mortgages and car loans. So as the Fed increases rates, that takes more money out of our pocket. So people talk about the pay gap as the amount of money that's coming into women's wallets. That's only part of the story. The other part of the story is that there's more money coming out of women's wallets. So across almost every gender cohort, the pay gap widened between 5 and 11 cents in the last year. So women already have less money coming into their wallets. They also now have more money coming out because of inflation, because of the measures to actually curb inflation. And one of the ways to actually curb inflation is to increase your labor supply. So if we focused on gender equity in the labor force and at least getting back to what we were pre-pandemic and bringing 1 million women into the labor force, we could close the gap of the 5 million people missing, that 2-to-1 ratio by 20%.
I mean, you say we can close the gap, but hearing you list all of those things and equally all the things that I listed, do you actually think gender equity is possible in the near term?
I do. I mean, that's why I started Pipeline, right? So the average Fortune 500 company has 60,000 employees. And we know from our implementations that there are 3 key decisions that they make across their talent each year, which is performance, potential, and pay. So for the average Fortune 500 company, that's 180,000 opportunities for them to move toward equity each and every year. That's what we make possible. Across the entire Fortune 500, it's 90 million opportunities. On average, our customers actually increase equity by 67% in the first 3 months on the platform. It is absolutely within our control. I mean, using technology, we can get there.
What would gender equity in the workplace look like? What would the workplace look like for all of us if gender equity existed?
Well, women would make up at least 51% of the labor force, if not 58% of the labor force. They would make up and down the line, so up the corporate ladder. They would make up at least 51% of those roles, and then, 51% of Fortune 500 CEOs. I mean, that, and then you can talk about elected office and venture capitalists, because women are only 9% of partners in VC firms. Equity would look like women being 51% of partners in VC firms.
I mean, that sounds pretty good to me. So I know that the clock is ticking, but I am going to ask you just one last question here, the final question. What is the biggest misconception you think companies have when it comes to gender equity?
Oh, wow. In 20 seconds or less? Well, there's a couple. One is that gender equity is a synonym for women's rights. We know that that's not true. Women are half the conversation, men are the other half. I talked about some of the statistics, but we know that 48% of working dads would like to stay home with their children, and the reason that they don't is identity and isolation, this sense of what it means to be a man in our society. The other piece is that companies believe that implicit bias training will close the equity gap, and it won't. Companies spend $8 billion a year on implicit bias training. And what the research shows is not only does it not work, it can actually make equity worse because it embeds stereotypes. So I would advocate for a redeployment of that $8 billion to more effective solutions. And in the United States, it's a $3.1 trillion opportunity that we could actually expand our economy if we move toward gender equity.
That's really interesting. I mean, I know you have a newsletter and you said today that bias training is trying to change the people and not change the actual systems, which is where it needs to be. We're out of time, so I'm going to have to stop there, although I could keep this conversation going for a long time. But thank you very much. And if anybody has questions, we are going to be around. I think that's definitely a very, very interesting topic. Thank you, Katica.
You bet.